W3a, Narrative Basic Elements, introduces us to the structure of any narrative style of writing, which could be a short story, or it could be poetry, or if you're really ambitious, it could be a novel. This particular target asks for several different skills, truly. The first is that you can engage and orient the reader by setting out a conflict, which will be the key of your story, establishing one or multiple points of view, introducing a narrator and or characters, and creating a smooth progression of experiences or events, or in other words, establishing a clear plot. At the 4 level, the addition is that your conflict has some significance to it, and that is clear to the reader through how you structure your story. At the 2 level, we're really talking about a difference in the point of view. Although it's not a fault if you only have one point of view in your 3 level, it would be ideal to see several. And at the 1 level, you can complete some of the skills above, or you can complete all skills but with limited depth. So this is a pretty traditional story map that you might see if you're talking about analysis of fiction or if you're talking about writing of fiction. And so we'll just go through these terms as a review here. The first thing that we can talk about is plot, and there are several different subparts to plot, and those would all fall under this lined area here. We start our story with a hook, just like we do in an essay, to grab attention. And there are many different ways you can do that. You can jump right into the action, you can jump into dialogue, you can give description of the setting, if the setting is going to be critical to your story, so on and so forth. We'll review those in a future target. The exposition is a term that a lot of people tend to forget. It's the background. Okay, so you gotta give some background on who your narrator or your character is, where they are, why they're there, that sort of thing. Your conflict is critical. Okay, if you don't have a strong conflict, you're not going to have a strong story. And we'll talk about the different types of conflict next. But no, for now, this is the problem of the story, if you want to think about it that way. Rising action, I like to think of as a series of responses to the conflict and then reflection. You've got your problem, what's your character going to do about it, and then what, and then what, and then what. And you can have as many of these as you need to develop your story. Okay, so you can think of it as response to conflict. And at some point, your character will hit their climax or their turning point. Something will change for better or worse. Either their conflict will be resolved or it won't. And then you've got your following action and your resolution. And I'll clump these two together and say, this is where we wrap up our loose ends. We'll tell where a character ends up and any other characters that we met along the way. We will deal with any major changes that occurred, what's the outcome of those between that following action and resolution phase of the story. Now there's some other story elements that you want to keep in mind too, your setting, your location, okay? But there are a couple things to that. I mean, that's your physical location, but it's also the culture in which you set your story. Could be the weather. All those things can play a role in setting. And they can change just as the story itself changes, the plot changes. Characterization, or how you create character. Those are all intentional choices you will have to make, and we'll talk about some different methods of doing that. Point of view, or who tells the story. Will it be third person, he, she, they? Will it be first person, I? And then the mood or the tone of the piece, which will be created through a combination of the plot and how you create your characters and your setting and point of view. Now some tips for strong plot development, which you'll want to see to earn yourself a 3 or a 4 for this particular target. Always start with your conflict. Great conflicts make great plots. Start here. Start with your conflict and make sure you've got a good one to work with. Okay, and you can even have multiple conflicts in place. That's a great way to strengthen your story. You might have a self-conflict. Perhaps a character doesn't have trust in him or herself. Perhaps a character is struggling with alcoholism. Those would be examples of self-conflicts. You can have a character versus character conflict. Maybe a character doesn't get along with another character. He has an arch enemy. Maybe a character doesn't get along with his boss. You can have a character versus nature conflict. Perhaps a character finds himself stranded on a desert island. Perhaps a character finds himself stuck in the middle of a storm. You can have character versus society. Maybe a character does not fit into his setting. We see this one a lot historically. Any story that typically takes place in the Jim Crow era South will feature racism, and that would be character versus society that the character finds him or herself in. You might have, especially in today's age, character versus technology. This is a very popular type of conflict right now. Technology could be seen as taking over, and the character may be fighting against that. You may have a character versus some supernatural element, or a character versus fate, or against God. You might think of, these are the things that are predetermined for me and I'm not happy with it. What can I do about it? That kind of conflict. Another tip for you, secondary conflicts can build better rising action. So again, if you've got multiple conflicts, you've got more to work with to develop your rising action, but you can also think of each rising action as being another problem that should relate back to the initial problem. For instance, if your story is character versus character, perhaps it's two students who are in a fight because, one of them cheated off of the other one on a test. Well, maybe a rising action, a secondary conflict, could be that it happens again. Or maybe a secondary conflict could be they start using social media to attack each other. We pull some technology in there and we use that to help develop our rising action. Some tips for character development. You'll want to remember that there are two types of character development. There's direct characterization and there's indirect. In direct characterization, we tell how a character is, and in indirect, we show through actions how a character is, and the reader has to infer what that will mean. So it's a bit more open-ended. I would recommend using direct characterization to give your characters physical attributes. What do they look like? What types of clothing do they wear, and how? Are their clothes baggy? Are they... sorry about that. Are they worn down? That sort of thing. You can do direct characterization to talk about any eccentricities that your character has, any odd quirks that they have, anything strange that they do. To talk about their temperament, what kind of a person are they? Are they generally cheerful or not? Their mannerisms, do they have a tendency to tap the leg when they're nervous? Do they have a tendency to stutter? Those types of things would all be appropriate for direct characterization. But your indirect characterization is going to be much more engaging. So once you do your direct characterization, you get all that out of the way, then you want to show how your character uses that. So what if they're constantly tapping their foot when they are nervous? How does that matter? Show us in the story that your character was tapping their foot all the way through a job interview when they're trying to get a major job. You can also show how your characters interact with others, okay? Rather than saying, well, Sally and Jim had a fight, you could say, instead, show us that fight. Sally shoved Jim backward, but Jim lashed out with his foot, knocking Sally to the ground. Show us what that looks like. Show how characters react to events. Rather than saying Sally was sad after her fight with Jim, you could say Sally sobbed gigantic tears as she huddled in the corner, upset about the fight with Jim, if you feel a need to clarify. But use that indirect characterization to help paint the picture for your reader, and you'll have a much more engaging story. So I just wanted to show you an example of what an outline might look like for a short story, and I've left out a lot here, but I wanted you to see what some concepts might look like. I started with a conflict here, and I came up with a conflict that Jane faces depression, which would be a self-conflict, and she has a character conflict. She doesn't get along with coworkers. So we've got two conflicts that we're working with, and I want to pull both of those into my outline and my eventual story. Now I would have gone back, and I went to my hook, and I thought, how can I show that she is both depressed and isn't getting along in an engaging way? And so I've got some action that I'm going to dive right into. My hook would be that Jane is hiding in her office bathroom, and she's crying, which might relate to her depression, but after a nasty comment, which would relate to her coworkers. So I'm pulling in both already. But I need some background after that. So I would need to learn, for instance, that Jane works at a law office and that the other lawyers are very cutthroat. There's no room for error, and if you do make an error, you would hear about it. Now I'm ready to deal with my conflict. So I established that this has been an ongoing struggle, that she is struggling with her depression. She's historically struggled with her coworkers. And now I need to start having some responses to that. So what that she is sad? So what that she doesn't get along? What might happen next? And so perhaps one rising action is another secondary conflict. She loses a major case. And as part of the secondary conflict above, that she doesn't get along with coworkers, her coworkers just rip her apart. So I tie in here. Now I want to make sure that I'm connecting strongly to the first conflict that we had, the depression. So my next rising action, Jane believes she will never be good at her job. This relates to the concept of depression and what one believes about oneself. So I'm making sure to address both of the conflicts I set. Now, if I were to truly write the story, I'd go on and I'd develop a few more rising action steps, but for the case of our example, I'll shorten it. Eventually, Jane gets around to quitting her job because she didn't believe she could do it, because her coworkers were mean, she decides to leave. And so this climax addresses both conflicts, okay? That's key here. If you're going to have multiple conflicts, you want to make sure that you address both of them all the way through to the end of your story. For my following action resolution, I don't want this to end on a bad note, so I'll have Jane doing some reflection on what she really likes to do, and eventually maybe she becomes a victim advocate. So she's still working within the law, but she's doing something she's much more comfortable with, finding herself, getting over her depression, and getting away from her negative coworkers. Now for some more development, when we talk about that character development and using both direct and indirect characterization, I want to show you what that might look like too. So I've created what could be the hook for the story that I just outlined. The slate gray wall of the toilet stall slammed shut and Jane sank to her knees. So I'm starting here with indirect. I'm going to do I for indirect. She slammed the stall door shut. She sank to her knees. Okay, and this is showing us that Jane is upset because she slammed. You don't slam a door if you're happy. And she's just collapsing. She's so down on her luck right now. Tears streamed down her thin, pale face, and her shoulders, hunched with stress, shook, but no sound came out. So the tears streaming in her shoulders shook. Both of those verbs are, again, indirect, showing us just how upset she is. But I'm also starting to work in some direct characterization so the reader can see her. She has a thin, pale face. Her shoulders are hunched with stress. This is direct characterization about what she's physically doing. And we're building that in to help paint a more vivid picture of what's going on. No sound came out. Indirect. Oh, here, I'll label these ones too. Direct. Indirect to show that she's trying to hold it back. They would not get that satisfaction. They would not know how deep their attacks cut. They would not know that she knew they were right. All of this series are things that are going on inside her mind, as is the next. She was useless, she was timid, she was a nobody. All of this, because it's going on in her mind, and it's being shared with us directly from the narrator, would be direct. And we're using that to get a picture of what she's thinking. The sob echoed off of the tile, a howl of pure pain. So now we've got action again. We've got an indirect to show that she's finally broken. She can't hold it in anymore. And we've got both in a positive and a metaphor here. The sob is a howl, animal-like, and some alliteration to boot to help paint a more vivid picture. So an example of how you might develop your character with both indirect and direct characterization.